Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
Peter Sullivan got a life sentence because of the brutality, ferocity and obscenity of the attack. He'd have to serve a minimum of 15 years, but release would always depend on him admitting to the murder, which he's always refused to do. And it meant that Sullivan stayed behind bars for 38 years.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Bruntand.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking they still haunt our imaginations.
In this double episode, we tell the story of the murder of florist and part-time barmaid Diane Sindall in 1986, and of the man convicted of her murder. Peter Sullivan spent 38 years in prison, but had his murder conviction quashed at the Court of Appeal in May 2025. It's thought to be the longest-running miscarriage of justice in British history. In this episode, we'll be asking what went wrong in the original investigation and trial. And in part 2, Martin will talk exclusively to Peter Sullivan's solicitor, Sarah Myatt, about the long, drawn-out process of appeal and how her client finally came to be exonerated. Martin, it sounds an extraordinary story, an appeal, and the thought of a man being wrongly imprisoned for 38 years. It's one you covered for Sky, isn't it?
It is, and it was a story that really came out of nowhere for me. I'd never heard of Peter Sullivan until late last year. And I don't suppose there are many crime reporters working today who go back that far and have covered the original case. After his conviction, Peter Sullivan disappeared into the prison system, and it was obscurity, really. Nobody was particularly aware of anything going on, his attempts to get himself freed. Then late last year, the local paper, the Liverpool Echo, reported that he'd got an appeal coming up. I had no idea at that stage the battle that he'd had over many years and had been knocked back several times. So I've come to know his solicitor, Sarah Myatt, a bit recently. And as I explore in my conversation with her, this is the latest in a series of miscarriage of justice scandals, and they do throw up questions about the fitness of the appeal and criminal case review process in the UK, and the problem of what you could call institutional inertia.
Martin, before we reflect on the appeal process and how miscarriages of justice are dealt with, let's go back to 1986, the crime itself, the original investigation and trial. But first of all, who was Diane Sindall?
Diane Sindall was 21. She was a part-time barmaid and florist, and she was engaged to be married. She was found half naked in a Birkenhead alleyway in August 1986. She had catastrophic head injuries, bite marks on her body, and evidence of sexual assault.
What happened?
The details are pretty grim. It was a horrible, violent attack on what was clearly a very vulnerable victim. Diane had just finished a shift behind the bar at the Wellington pub in Bebbington. She was working there to save money for this upcoming wedding. Her florist van, a blue Fiat Fiorino, had run out of petrol as she drove home. So she grabbed a plastic can from the back of the van and began walking along Borough Road. This was a busy, well-lit road. She was looking for a nearest petrol station. But at some point before she could find one, shortly after midnight, she was hit multiple times on the head and indecently assaulted. Now, 12 hours later, a woman out walking her dog discovered Diane's body in a narrow alleyway off the main road. It was clear from the start that this had been a frenzied attack. She'd been beaten about the face, the head and the body. She'd sustained multiple fractures, and intriguingly there were bite marks on her body. Her bra and her T-shirt had been pulled up around her neck, and her jeans, shoes, knickers and handbag were missing. She was still wearing her diamond engagement ring. I think if police initially ever considered robbery as a motive, then they quickly dismissed that idea.
It's awful to think, isn't it, Martin, that she ran out of petrol. And had she not run out of petrol, maybe she'd be still here today. I didn't really realise that detail.
Yeah, what a tragic turn of events. I guess we've all run out of petrol at some point, but to be an attractive, young, vulnerable woman in the dark, that time of the year, having to walk along even a well-lit road, she must have felt rather scared.
Yeah, I'm sure she did. Well, Merseyside Police launched the biggest murder inquiry in its history in the hunt to try and find Diane's killer. And many officers said that the nature of the attack made it the worst case they'd ever investigated. Initially, I seem to recall, it seemed there were lots of promising eyewitness sightings.
There were, but the police clearly needed more. And I think as a sign of that and the high-profile nature of the case, the lead-up to Diane's murder was later reconstructed for the BBC's Crime Watch programme. Now, those witnesses, at about 11:45pm, so quarter to midnight, witnesses saw Diane stop her van near a roundabout in Borough Road. There was a bus driver called Gary Lamb. He came forward and he told police that he'd spotted Diane just after midnight near a bus stop. There was another sighting a bit later by a taxi driver. He said he saw a woman struggling with a man. He said they were arguing, and to him it appeared that they knew each other. Detectives appealed for the driver of a white Ford Sierra, a car that was seen parked in a bus stop lay-by on Borough Road about the time of the murder, across from the alleyway where the body was found.
And then 2 weeks later, Diane's jeans, underwear, green high-heeled shoes and a handbag were found burned on Bidston Hill, just outside Birkenhead.
Another witness later recalled seeing a man who he knew was called Peter behaving oddly nearby, and he described him as having a long nose and tattooed arms. 6 weeks after the murder, a plainclothes policeman walked into a pub in Birkenhead, and after he'd been talking to Peter Sullivan, noticed Sullivan's pointed nose and forearm tattoos. 3 days later, the police raided Sullivan's home and found a crowbar, which they connected to the case. But Sullivan had no prior history of violence, and he was 5 feet 7 inches tall, rather shorter than witness accounts of the taller man at the scene. Peter Sullivan was 29 at the time, unemployed with a learning disability. Quite a vulnerable person, and he had an IQ of just 72.
And I gather initially he denied the attack, but then under police questioning quickly confessed, and that's when he was charged with murder.
The confession seemed to override the lack of real evidence against him. Sullivan was interrogated without a lawyer or an appropriate adult. This was required under the then newly introduced PACE Act, or Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, for vulnerable individuals. So anybody who seemed to be vulnerable should be given what they call an appropriate adult, somebody to represent their interests and make sure that there's a kind of sense of fair play in the way that the police deal with that suspect. In a taped interview, Sullivan confessed to Diane's murder, and he said, "I don't know why I hit her." He described how he stopped Diane on Borough Road late at night and asked her the time before lashing out with a brick. But then, after access to a lawyer, Sullivan retracted that confession. He said that apart from going to a nearby shop, he'd spent the night of Diane's death watching TV with his pregnant common-law wife and twin stepsons before going to bed just before midnight. He appeared to have quite a strong alibi, backed up by his common-law wife. Sullivan later said he'd been pressured into confessing, and he said this: "Why would I go out and kill a girl like that, only 21 years of age? She's got a lot to live for. I have got no reason to go out and kill anybody," he told the police. It later emerged that Sullivan was denied legal advice for 48 hours after his arrest. The police excuse for that was that they claimed it would hinder the inquiry.
Gosh, that's an interesting thing to come out. And by the time of Sullivan's trial at Liverpool Crown Court in 1987, the case was notorious, and the media, it feels, had perhaps already convicted him in the court of public opinion.
I don't think there's much doubt about that. For instance, The Sun called Sullivan the Beast of Birkenhead, publishing his mugshot with the headline, "Monster's Cold Eyes." The prosecution claimed Sullivan murdered Diane in a drunken rage after losing a darts match earlier in the day, arming himself with a crowbar and then committing this terrible crime. They played up the sense of monstrous, claiming that bite marks found on Diane's body proved Mr. Sullivan was the murderer.
How did the papers, Martin, get away with headlines like that? Beast of Birkenhead, Monster's Cold Eyes.
Well, in the context of the trial, after the trial was concluded and he'd been convicted, then you can more or less say what you like. I think they must have been rather more restrained while the trial was going on. But whenever they use terms like that, it's always in inverted commas, as though they're attributing it to perhaps somebody else or general public opinion.
The bite mark analysis was a crucial factor at the trial, wasn't it? But fairly controversial.
Very controversial. The forensic odontologist, Dr. Alan Billings, claimed that bite marks on Diane's breast matched Sullivan's teeth. He said the teeth marks were as unique as a fingerprint. And the prosecution said that such evidence was so critical, so crucial, that you can forget the rest of the case. It's quite unbelievable that they should have adopted that kind of language. But the defence barely challenged the expert, who later admitted his methods were subjective. So even in hindsight, the expert was saying that he wasn't being entirely objective in his evidence. And the whole bite mark analysis has since been discredited anyway as pseudoscience. And there was no saliva analysis in those days.
So apart from Sullivan's retracted confession, was there any compelling hard evidence to pin him properly to the murder?
There was nothing, really. Semen was recovered from her body, but it wasn't tested for DNA. DNA analysis wasn't routinely used in criminal investigations at that stage. That was all still a long way off. There were no fingerprints or eyewitnesses linking Sullivan to the murder scene. This was 1986, a time when forensic science was primitive, very much the early days of forensic science. Police clung to those bite marks and confession, even when they made no sense. Remember, it was a high-profile case. Before they'd arrested Peter Sullivan, there was, of course, a killer on the loose. Other women were deemed to be in danger until somebody had been arrested for it. So the police were under an awful lot of pressure to come up with a result and solve the case. I mean, that doesn't explain their shoddy investigation and the wrongful arrest and conviction of Peter Sullivan. None of that excuses the way the police behaved in Peter Sullivan's case. What they did have, of course, was a circumstantial link. And lawyers will tell you that sometimes in prosecution, circumstantial evidence is enough to convict somebody. Witnesses claim Sullivan was seen near where Diane's burning clothes were found on Bidston Hill.
And there was a strange twist to the stolen clothes story, wasn't there?
There was. Listen to this. During the trial, the judge was forced to dramatically halt his summing up because a Mr. X, he was never been named, came forward to claim he stole Diane's handbag, her cash, her clothing and her earrings after stumbling across her dead body at 6 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd of August. That was just hours after the murder. This mystery man also admitted he was the person spotted running away from Bidston Hill after he'd set fire to Diane's belongings there the day after the killing.
So why didn't this development stop or halt proceedings and get the authorities to think again?
Well, it ought to have done. Anybody with common sense would suggest that this was a major intervention. But it didn't happen. Mr. X was arrested and interviewed several times by the police, but they concluded that he could not have been the killer because analysis of his teeth impressions did not match those found on Diane's breasts. This mystery man later withdrew his evidence anyway and said that he'd made up the claim after reading newspaper reports and hearing details from a police and hospital source. It was all rather ridiculous.
Sometimes the police have just 24 hours to gather enough information to charge someone who they believe has committed a serious crime. Could you gather enough information on motive, means and opportunity before the time runs out? If you're fascinated by true crime, then join us in June 2025 for CrimeCon London. Meet the biggest names in true crime TV, experience live forensic demonstrations, and dive deep into the criminal mind with your favourite authors, podcasters, and content creators. From cold case reviews to immersive sessions with crime scene experts and police dogs, this is your chance to be part of the UK's biggest true crime event. Go to crimecon.co.uk now to secure your tickets. CrimeCon London, partnered by True Crime Channel, June 7th and 8th, 2025. The clock is ticking. Find out more and secure your place now at crimecon.co.uk.
How will history judge American President Donald Trump?
If they don't kiss the ring, they are our enemy.
Podcast Creating History takes stock, with insights from historian David Reynolds on Trump's unconventional, unpredictable, and always controversial reset of international relations.
I win, you lose. That's what deals are about.
Listen to Creating History wherever you get your podcasts.
Diane's fiancé, who was cleared by police, appeared as a witness in court. He broke down describing their wedding plans, and that was a moment that jurors later cited as pivotal.
I think people can understand that. His evidence was raw, emotional, tear-jerking, and it seemed to boost, I suppose in quite obvious ways, the prosecution case against Peter Sullivan. And the jury convicted him after just 3 hours of deliberation. That's no time at all. The judge described the murder as, quote, an abomination because of the brutality, ferocity and obscenity of the attack. Peter Sullivan got a life sentence and was told that he'd have to serve a minimum of 15 years before he'd be considered for parole. But release would always depend, like in other life cases, on him admitting to the murder, which he's always refused to do. And it meant that Sullivan stayed behind bars for 38 years, so much more than double the original sentence.
That's extraordinary in itself, isn't it? That if he knew he could be released, but yet was determined that he wasn't going to admit to the murder, in some ways, to me, just listening to the story, that speaks volumes.
You'd have thought, perhaps, if you can put yourself in that position, and I know it's very difficult, you'd have thought after 15 years, you might be tempted to admit that you'd done it just to win your freedom. But I suppose it is a sign of his determination and above all, of course, a sign of his innocence that he stuck it out. But to stay on for all those years afterwards that he could have been enjoying life is extraordinary. It's proved to be worth it in the end, but what a sacrifice he made in that battle to prove his innocence.
Heartbreaking too. There's always so many victims in these cases for his family. His sister, Kim Sullivan, has said Peter wouldn't hurt a fly. They've destroyed him.
She did. Sullivan's family, like him, have always protested his innocence. He quite easily convinced them that he wasn't the killer. Sister Kim described him as a gentle, easily led individual, which was in complete contrast to the hardened drinker stereotypes of that era in that part of the world. Sullivan was unemployed and with learning difficulties, became, I suppose, an easy target for the police who, as I said, were under great pressure to solve this case. The press painted him as a predator, and that's the narrative that stuck for decades.
Once convicted, it's very difficult, and it's a long, drawn-out process to appeal, let alone get a conviction reviewed and overturned. What happened, Martin?
Well, it is very difficult to get stuff like this overturned. And one thing I've learned in my many years of covering crime is that the criminal justice system simply hates to admit mistakes. So if you are in a position like Peter Sullivan, you've got a huge battle ahead of you. Even in the case of quite compelling evidence that proves your innocence. So in 1988, Sullivan's first appeal was dismissed. the court upholding the conviction. And that was despite his lawyers arguing that the confession was coerced by the police and bite mark evidence was flawed. And then again in 2008, the Criminal Cases Review Commission refused to refer Sullivan's case to the Court of Appeal, saying on this occasion there was insufficient DNA to test the semen samples that had been retained. Forensic Science Service experts at the time claimed that testing would yield no useful profile. That was clearly proved wrong all those years later. It was that was challenged successfully by Sullivan's legal team in 2021, and it's that's finally led to the appeal court ruling this year that quashed the original conviction.
Just going back to something you said a few moments ago, that Sullivan was told he would have to serve a minimum of 15 years before he'd be considered for release, but release was contingent on him admitting to the murder. If he was told he had to serve a minimum of 15 years, is there no way then you can appeal on release for good behaviour because you've served your time? I was quite surprised when you said it was contingent to him admitting the crime.
No, if you're given a life sentence, that really does mean a life sentence, because even though you get to a point where you can apply for parole, it's not guaranteed. You do have to convince the parole board that you're safe to be released. And if you fail to acknowledge your crime, that's deemed to be a big part of the danger that you still pose. The idea that you'll get off for good behaviour doesn't apply in the case of a life sentence. So when you are eventually released on parole from a life sentence, you're still on licence for the rest of your life. You are still in danger of being brought back to prison if you commit other crimes or if you breach any other restriction that's put on that licence after your parole has been granted.
And he's out now after 38 years, but who's really driven that? Do you think Sullivan himself has driven the appeals process, or has he had a legal team behind him who really realised that perhaps there had been a miscarriage of justice here?
No, he eventually convinced Sarah Myatt, the solicitor we'll be talking to in the next episode. He had a very, very worthwhile case. She spent many years investigating his case. It wasn't easy. The first hurdle was for her to believe what he was saying. The only path to the appeal court is to go through the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which is quite a controversial body at the moment, particularly because on a number of occasions it has turned down cases that subsequently did go to the appeal court and where eventually those individuals were deemed to be not guilty or to have been convicted unsafely. It's still a major battle, but you can't do it on your own. I can't remember any particularly high-profile prisoner who's won an appeal without some kind of legal help and ultimately with the support of the Criminal Cases Review Commission.
It really is hard to think of someone spending 38 years behind bars for a crime they didn't commit. A man who would go into prison in his late 20s and come out, presumably, if my maths is correct, around late 60s. Sullivan will never get those years back, one could argue perhaps the best years of his life, and presumably no amount of compensation will ever make up for that lost time.
Well, imagine being convicted of any crime if you didn't commit it. But to be wrongly jailed over something so grim and high profile, to be labelled, as he was, a sadistic sex killer, it's impossible to imagine what that must be like. He spent 14,000 days in prison when he shouldn't have been there at all, not for one day. You mentioned compensation. He should get compensation, and I've seen speculation that he could be in line to get £1 million. If he was to win £1 million, that's hardly compensation for all those lost years. But it's not automatic. He's still got to go through a legal process and employ a lawyer to fight for any compensation. They're not simply going to hand it over to him. One of the issues around compensation, one of the extraordinary things was that until recently, in the calculation of what you're going to be given as compensation for a miscarriage of justice, the Ministry of Justice would always deduct a sum for board and lodging.
Board and lodging.
Board and lodging,
It's not exactly the finest board and lodging in the world, is it?
No,
especially if you shouldn't have been there.
Well, quite. How on earth the system can begin to think that the public would accept the idea that an innocent man who spent 38 years in prison when he shouldn't have spent a day there should, in the calculation of his compensation, be deducted bed and breakfast, if you like, or bed, breakfast, lunch and evening meal, and particularly at a time when prison food is not the best. It seems extraordinary that until recently, that's how the system worked. There was such a public outrage when it emerged not that long ago that I'm pretty sure that system has been dropped.
And after 38 years lost, now he's got to spend time fighting for some compensation is absolutely outrageous to me. We'll hear more about Peter Sullivan's successful appeal by the solicitor who lodged it, Sarah Myatt, in our next episode. Here's a clip of what she said.
Oh, it was a moment that will stay with me forever. I was in the office. I received a phone call from the CCRC to say that the DNA results had come back and that they were not a match with Peter. And that was just groundbreaking. It was amazing.
You can listen to Martin's full interview with Sarah in our next episode and get a real behind-the-scenes insight into what happened in this extraordinary case. We'll also be discussing what the case means and how it compares to other recent stories of miscarriages of justice. Join us then. Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.